Welcome to the Sleepy Economist. Tonight, we're going to drift through one of the oldest ideas in economics, an idea that keeps coming back, generation after generation, often wearing different clothes with a new logo pinned to the lapel. That idea is tariffs, not as a debate, not as a tribal chant, just as a quiet, practical question. What happens when the rules for trade change and businesses don't know what the rules will be next month? Over the last few days, tariff policy has been back at the center of the story because the legal footing under some US tariffs was challenged, and because the response to that challenge introduced a different path to tariffs with a different authority and a different timeline. If you're listening to Unwind, you don't need to memorize names, dates, or numbers. You can let this be like a slow train passing in the distance, steady, rhythmic, and not asking anything from you. We'll start with the present, then glide backward through history and return, softly, to what this tends to mean for markets, for prices, and for everyday life. 1. The fog matters more than the forecast. In economics, people often focus on the level of something. What is the tariff rate? 10%? 15%? 20%? But often, what shapes real decisions is not the level. It's the uncertainty. Uncertainty is a fog, and fog doesn't have to be thick to slow traffic. It just has to be unpredictable. When rules are stable, businesses can plan. They can sign long contracts. They can invest in new equipment. They can build a factory that won't pay off for 5 or 10 years. But when rules might swing, when a tariff is on, then off, then replaced, then challenged, decision-making changes. Companies delay. They hoard inventory just in case. They raise prices not because costs already rose, but because costs might rise. And nobody wants to be the person caught with thin margins when the rules change overnight. This is one reason tariff headlines punch above their weight. A tariff can be 10%, but the uncertainty can feel like 50%. 2. What's in the headlines right now? Here's the calm version of what's been happening in the news. A US Supreme Court ruling deemed certain tariffs imposed under a specific emergency law illegal, and that set off a chain reaction in how those tariffs are handled at the border. US Customs and Border Protection said it would stop collecting those specific tariffs at a set time, and the question of refunds and transitions immediately became part of the business conversation. Meanwhile, a new global tariff was announced under a different legal authority, effectively aiming to replace what was struck down, shifting the policy from one lane of law to another. Abroad, you can see the practical effects in reactions from industry groups, like Swiss manufacturing interests describing tariff changes as adding to chaos and emphasizing how uncertainty discourages investment. This is the story behind the story. Not just tariffs up or tariffs down, but tariffs unclear. And unclear tariffs are a special kind of noise because trade is built on confidence and planning. 3. What is a tariff really? A tariff is an import tax. If something costs £100 at the border and there's a 10% tariff, the importer pays £10 in tariff. Now, who pays that in real life? In the simplest story, the importer pays it. But economics likes to ask the next question. Does the importer absorb it in profit? Do they pass it to customers in higher prices? Do they push the cost back onto suppliers? Do they reroute supply chains? Do they stop importing entirely? The real answer is usually some mix. And the mix depends on timing, competition, and how easy it is to substitute. If you can easily switch suppliers, tariffs change behavior quickly. If you can't, tariffs show up more in prices. But even this isn't the most interesting part. The most interesting part is that tariffs do two things at once. They change prices and they change relationships. Prices are what you see. Relationships are what you feel later. 4. Why tariffs keep returning. Tariffs are old, older than income tax in many places, older than central banks as we know them. And they return because they're simple to explain. Make foreign goods more expensive, so local goods win. That's a story almost anyone can understand in one sentence. But the economy is never one sentence. A tariff can protect a local industry in the short run. It can also raise costs for local businesses that use imported parts. It can reshape jobs in one region while raising prices nationwide. It can create leverage in negotiations while inviting retaliation. So, tariffs are often described as tools, but they are also signals. A tariff signals that trade is no longer just trade. It's strategy. 5. A bedtime walk through the classic example, Smoot-Hawley. Let's step back softly into the early 1930s, the Great Depression era. In that period, the US passed a famous tariff law, often used as a cautionary tale, Smoot-Hawley. Here's the quiet lesson. When the economy is under stress, leaders want to protect jobs. Protection feels like safety. But if many countries do it at once, each protecting themselves, the world can end up with less trade, weaker growth, and deeper pain. Now, it's important not to turn history into a cartoon. Smoot-Hawley didn't cause the Great Depression by itself. The Depression had many forces behind it: monetary policy mistakes, banking crises, collapsing demand, debt deflation. But tariffs can act like a headwind. If your economy is already struggling to breathe, a headwind matters. And tariffs can also do something more subtle. They can damage trust. Trade is not only contracts and ships, it's expectations. And once expectations break, rebuilding them can take years. 6. The 5 channels tariffs touch. For a moment, imagine the economy as a house with 5 rooms. Tariffs can walk through all 5. Prices. Some goods get more expensive, sometimes quickly, sometimes slowly. Margins. Businesses either accept lower profit or pass costs to customers, or both. Supply chains. Companies reroute. They Friendshore, they diversify, they stockpile, investment. This is the fog room. If policy is uncertain, investment slows. Diplomacy, tariffs can be bargaining chips or sparks, and sometimes both. When you hear tariff news, the temptation is to ask, will prices go up? That's a fair question. But the deeper question is often, what will this do to long-term planning? 7. Why markets react so fast? You'll often see markets move on tariff headlines immediately. That's because markets are not reacting to the tariff as an accounting line. They are reacting to future inflation, uncertainty, future profit uncertainty, and future growth uncertainty. Even central banks can be pulled into this. If tariffs raise prices, that can look like inflation. But if tariffs slow growth, that can look like a reason to ease. And if the policy path is unclear, it becomes harder for policymakers to decide what to do next. So tariffs can become a kind of policy smoke. Everyone squints, everyone guesses, everyone recalculates. 8. The quiet takeaway for tonight. Let's end this section with a calm, non-dramatic thought. The biggest economic impact of tariffs is often not the tariff itself. It's the second-order effects, the delays, the caution, the pricing buffers, the wait and see posture. That's why this topic keeps trending. Because it's not just a tax, it's a question mark. And businesses don't love question marks. In the next section, we'll move into a few historical echoes beyond Smoot-Hawley, including how tariff threats become negotiation tactics, how retaliation works, and why some tariff cycles fade quietly, while others spiral. You don't need to decide if tariffs are good or bad tonight. Just notice the pattern. When uncertainty rises, the world gets a little more cautious. And caution, at scale, becomes an economic force. Now let's move to the next layer. How tariffs behave in the real world, not on paper. 1. Tariffs as a tool and as a threat. In practice, tariffs often operate like a lever. Sometimes they're designed to raise revenue or protect an industry. But very often, they're used as negotiating pressure. That's why today's headlines keep emphasizing not only the tariff level, but the credibility and durability of the legal pathway behind it. In recent days, the story has been shaped by a US Supreme Court decision, striking down the legal basis for a set of broad, global tariffs, followed quickly by the administration pivoting to a different statute. Section 122 of the Trade Act of 1974, to impose a temporary global tariff that began at 10%, with public discussion of raising it to 15%. This matters because businesses don't just ask, what's the rate? They ask, is this stable? Is this enforceable? Is it going to change again next week? And when the answer is maybe, the economy gets jumpier. So, to summarize this section, tariffs aren't just policy, they're posture. And posture creates uncertainty. Now let's talk about the most predictable response to tariffs. 2. Retaliation. the quiet mirror. When one country raises tariffs, others often respond. Sometimes with matching tariffs, sometimes with investigations, sometimes with targeted measures that feel symbolic. The point isn't always economic efficiency. Sometimes the point is, don't set a precedent that you can be pushed around. In that sense, tariffs function like a public negotiation, where both sides need to look strong enough not to invite the next demand. And that's why tariff cycles can feel like a kind of echo chamber. Tariffs are announced, markets react, countermeasures are threatened, businesses pause investment, supply chains reroute, and then the original plan gets adjusted again. Even when the real economic impact ends up smaller than feared, the process alone can produce real damage through delay and caution. And when officials talk about tariffs rising above 10% for some countries, or being modified country by country, this adds another layer. Firms don't only think about what they pay, they think about whether they'll be treated differently than a competitor based on where a product was assembled or shipped. So, to summarize this section, retaliation isn't an exception. It's part of the mechanism. Tariffs are rarely a one-way street. Now let's move from governments to businesses, the part of the story most people don't see. 3. The supply chain response. Don't get caught. When a tariff hits, a company usually tries a few moves, calmly, methodically. First, inventory. If you think costs might rise, you might import early. You stockpile, you build a buffer. Second, substitution. Can you source from elsewhere? Can you redesign? Can you use a different input? Third, reclassification and routing. Firms look at how goods are categorized, how rules of origin work, and where final assembly occurs. Fourth, pricing. Prices don't always rise immediately. Sometimes companies hold prices steady to keep market share. But when uncertainty persists, they often raise prices just in case, because nobody wants to be the only one caught with fixed prices and rising costs. This is why tariff news can feel inflationary, even before it shows up in official inflation data. And it's also why business groups often complain about chaos, because supply chains are built on lead times, contracts, and predictable rules. When the rules are unclear, the planning horizon shrinks. So, to summarize this section, businesses respond to tariffs by building buffers, inventory buffers, supplier buffers, and price buffers. And buffers are a cost. Now we can connect this to a bigger macro question. What does all this do to growth and central banks? 4. Tariffs and central banks. Inflation up, growth down. Tariffs are awkward for central banks because they can push on both sides of the mandate. Tariffs can raise prices, or at least raise price pressure. But tariffs can also slow growth by reducing trade volume, raising input costs, and discouraging investment. That creates a policy fog. Is this inflation you should look through, or inflation that will stick? And when the legal basis of tariffs is contested, when the market isn't sure which tariff regime will exist 2 months from now, that fog gets thicker. That's why commentary has been emphasizing the way tariff uncertainty clouds the outlook and makes rate paths harder to judge, and why market narratives can swing from day to day. There's another quiet link too: government revenue. Tariffs are money collected at the border. If the legal basis changes, questions appear. What's collected, what's refunded, and what's replaced? That administrative uncertainty matters for importers, and it can matter for budgeting expectations too. So, to summarize this section, tariffs can look like inflation and feel like slowdown at the same time. Exactly the mix that makes policymaking difficult. Now we'll do the calming thing history is good at, showing that none of this is new. 5. History doesn't repeat, but it does rhyme. Let's revisit a few tariff moments, not for drama, just for pattern recognition. Smoot-Hawley, 1930. A famous case where protection rose in a fragile moment. It didn't cause the Great Depression, but it became part of the broader tightening of global trade relations, an extra headwind at the worst time. 1971, the import surcharge era, Nixon. This is a useful example because it shows how trade policy can be used as leverage during monetary strain. Trade tools and currency tools often travel together, even when the public story focuses on only one. 1980s, US to Japan, tensions. You saw negotiated restraints, targeted protections, and a lot of political pressure around manufacturing. The key lesson wasn't just which policy was chosen, it was that trade becomes a stage for domestic politics, especially when industries feel threatened. Early 2000s steel tariffs. Another reminder that tariffs can be politically popular and economically messy. They help some producers while raising costs for downstream users. 2018 to 2019 US-China tariff cycle. This one is especially relevant because it introduced a modern template. Tariffs, retaliation, supply chain adjustment, and multi-year decoupling language, followed by companies rethinking geographic concentration risk. Across all of these, the pattern is consistent. Tariffs are introduced as solutions. They create second-order effects. Those effects feed political narratives. And then, policy adjusts again. History also shows something else, something softer. Most tariff regimes don't last forever in their original form. They either expand, mutate, get negotiated into something else, or fade when priorities change. Which leads to the most sleepy economist observation of all. The economy is rarely transformed by a single policy announcement. It's transformed by the accumulation of cautious decisions made in response. So, to summarize this section, history's lesson isn't tariffs always do X. It's that tariff cycles create predictable behaviors: retaliation, rerouting, buffering, and delayed investment. Now we'll shift into the last layer for tonight: how this story can show up in ordinary life, quietly. 6. The household layer. The slow drift of cost. Most people don't pay tariffs directly. They encounter them as a price that rises, a product that's out of stock, a new version of something that quietly uses cheaper materials, or a service that increases fees because inputs rose. Even when the effect is subtle, it can feel emotionally loud because it touches the basics: clothing, electronics, cars, building materials, household goods. And when tariff policy becomes a rolling uncertainty rather than a one-time change, companies are more likely to do the quiet thing. They raise prices gradually. They blame cost pressures. They avoid making promises. Sometimes the real cost isn't the tariff. It's the friction, the paperwork, the compliance, the renegotiation, the time. And friction accumulates. So, to summarize this final section, households feel tariffs not as a headline, but as a slow drift: prices, availability, and quality, all nudged by uncertainty and friction. And that's a good place to pause this segment without pausing the flow of the overall episode. Because if there's one calm takeaway to keep, it's this: tariffs are not only a number. They're a change in the predictability of the system. And predictability is, quietly, one of the most valuable resources an economy has. So far, we've covered the basic mechanism. Tariffs change prices, and uncertainty changes behavior. And that second part often matters more. To summarize where we are, tariffs are not just a tax, they're a question mark. And question marks make everyone cautious. Now we'll do something calmer and more concrete. We'll trace one simple object through the chain, from factory to shelf, not because you need math tonight, but because a story is easier to hold than a debate. 1. A simple tariff to price story. Imagine a small appliance, a kettle, a blender, a rice cooker, something ordinary. Let's say it leaves a factory with a wholesale price of £100. That £100 isn't what you pay. It's what the importer pays before everything else. From there, a few layers happen: shipping and insurance, port fees, customs processing, warehousing, the importer's margin, the retailer's margin, and then VAT, or sales tax, depending on where you live. Now, introduce a tariff. If the tariff is 10%, that is an extra £10 at the border. Here's the key detail: that £10 doesn't have to become £10 for you. Because the tariff is added early in the chain, and margins are often calculated as a percentage, it can ripple. If the importer's margin is a percentage of cost, and the retailer's margin is a percentage of their cost, then the extra £10 can turn into more than £10 by the time it reaches the shelf. Not always. Sometimes margins compress. Sometimes retailers eat it. Sometimes the supplier discounts to keep market share. But over time, when uncertainty lingers, the default behavior tends to look like this. A little of the cost gets passed forward. A little gets absorbed, and a little gets buffered as just in case. And that just in case piece is important, because businesses don't only respond to tariffs that exist. They respond to tariffs that might exist. When rules feel unstable, companies build safety cushions. So the consumer doesn't just pay for the tariff. The consumer can also end up paying for the risk management around the tariff. Summary of this section: a tariff is applied early, and even if the tariff is small, uncertainty can create extra padding through the chain. Now we'll move from prices to something businesses care about even more than prices: how a product is officially defined. 2. The quiet world of rules of origin. If you ever want to feel the true texture of global trade, don't start with politics. Start with paperwork. Because in tariff land, one question matters enormously. Where is something from? That sounds simple until you try to answer it. A product can be designed in one country, made of parts from 5 countries, assembled in a 6th, packaged in a 7th, shipped through an 8th. So when a tariff targets imports from country X, businesses immediately ask, does my product count as from country X? Or can it be legitimately considered from country Y because final assembly happened there? Or because enough value was added there? This is what people mean when they talk about rules of origin. It's not always a loophole. Often, it's just the legal structure of trade agreements. But it has a very real effect. When tariffs rise, supply chains don't only move. They sometimes relabel their own reality through changes in assembly and sourcing that alter origin status. And this is part of why tariff cycles can drive longer-term shifts even when the immediate economic impact seems modest. Because once a company spends money to redesign its supply chain, new suppliers, new factories, new contracts, those decisions tend to stick. Trade flows don't snap back instantly. They drift. Summary of this section: tariffs increase the value of where something counts as being from, and that drives long-term supply chain redesign. Now we'll talk about the phrase that keeps showing up in business commentary: friendshoring. 3. Friendshoring, nearshoring, and the new geography of caution. In older eras, the story of globalization was mostly about cost. Make it where it's cheapest. Ship it where it's needed. But over the last decade, another variable has pushed its way into the spreadsheet: reliability. If you're running a company, you don't only want the cheapest supplier. You want a supplier that won't vanish behind new rules. You want a route that won't get blocked by sanctions, tariffs, sudden licensing requirements, or political shifts. So you hear terms like nearshoring, producing closer to your customers; reshoring, bringing production back home; friendshoring, shifting production to countries seen as politically aligned or safer partners. This isn't just ideology, it's insurance. And insurance is rarely free. When production shifts away from the absolute cheapest location, cost can rise. But for a company, the trade-off can still be worth it, because the cost of uncertainty can be worse than the cost of slightly higher production. This is one of those situations where a spreadsheet can't capture the whole truth. Because the cost of a tariff headline isn't always a line item. It's a psychological reweighting. Companies start to value stability more than the last drop of efficiency. And when enough companies do that at once, it shows up in the macro story. More redundancy, more inventory, more regional production. less hyper-efficiency, and occasionally higher prices. Not necessarily permanently, but enough to matter. Summary of this section. Friendshoring is a business response to uncertainty, trading some efficiency for reliability. Now we'll slow down and look at something that's easy to miss. Why tariff changes can feel like they hit before they actually hit. 4. Why the anticipation becomes the event. There's a classic pattern in markets and business planning. The expectation moves first. The reality follows. If a business believes tariffs are likely to rise, it might. Buy inventory early. Rush shipments. Prepay for components. Lock contracts sooner. Raise prices gradually before costs show up. And when many businesses do this, you can see short-term distortions. Ports get busier. Shipping rates can twitch. Warehouse space gets tight. And some categories show price movement earlier than expected. It's not always dramatic. Sometimes it's just a subtle squeeze. But it explains why tariff headlines can feel inflationary, even when the official data hasn't yet changed much. The anticipation creates behavior. The behavior creates costs. The costs shape prices. So, in a strange way, the tariff isn't only a tax. It can become a signal that triggers a chain of defensive moves. Summary of this section. Anticipation drives action, and action creates real economic effects, even before the tariff settles into place. Now we'll widen the lens just slightly to connect this to the psychology of policymakers and the language you'll hear in official statements. 5. The language of bargaining and the language of certainty. When governments talk about tariffs, you'll often hear two different tones. One tone is bargaining. We're considering, we're reviewing, we're prepared to. All options are on the table. The other tone is certainty. This will take effect on this rate applies. This is the framework. Businesses don't love bargaining language because bargaining language implies the number is not the number. It's a starting position. Now, bargaining can be effective. It can bring people to the table. It can extract concessions. But it also spreads the fog, and fog changes behavior. So, a lot of what you see in tariff trending moments is not really about the tariff itself. It's about the market trying to figure out whether this is a permanent shift, a temporary bargaining chip, or the beginning of a wider cycle of escalation. That's why legal pathways and policy authority matter so much in headlines, because they hint at durability. Summary of this section. Markets react to whether tariffs are bargaining chips or stable rules, because stability determines planning. Now we'll bring all of this into a calm what to listen for list. Signals that show up in company language long before big macro data moves. 6. What to watch, softly, without obsessing. If you want to understand how tariffs are affecting the real economy without doom-scrolling headlines, there are 3 gentle indicators you can listen for. First, corporate phrasing. When executives start repeating words like uncertainty, visibility, policy volatility, supply chain reconfiguration, cost headwinds, pricing actions. That's a clue that the fog is changing behavior. Second, inventory language. If you hear, "We're building inventory," "We pulled forward shipments," "We're increasing safety stock," that's often a tariff-adjacent response. Third, guidance confidence. When guidance gets softer, more ranges, more "it depends," fewer firm commitments, that's uncertainty showing up in financial language. None of these require you to become a macro trader. They're just quiet signals. The economy speaks in tone. Summary of this section. Listen for language, uncertainty, inventory moves, and softer guidance, because those show tariff impact early. And with that, we've moved from headlines to mechanisms to the way tariffs show up in business decisions. The next step is to look at a few historical mini parallels that are calmer than the World War II scale examples, moments where trade tools were used as leverage, and what the aftermath looked like. Up to now, we've stayed close to the mechanism. Tariffs create costs, but uncertainty creates behavior, and behavior at scale creates macro outcomes. Quick summary before we shift. The headline is the spark, but the economy reacts through buffers: inventory buffers, supplier buffers, price buffers, and confidence buffers. Now we'll step into a few historical mini-stories that are calmer than the war-era case studies. Examples where trade tools were used as leverage, where the effects were real, and where the aftermath teaches something practical about cycles. 1. 1971. When trade and money travel together. In 1971, the United States made a dramatic change to the global monetary system by ending the direct convertibility of the dollar into gold for foreign governments, an event often referred to as the Nixon shock. At the same time, the US introduced a temporary import surcharge, a tariff-like measure intended to apply pressure in international negotiations. You don't have to hold every detail. The calm idea is enough. When a country feels strained by inflation, by deficits, by competitiveness, trade tools and currency tools often appear in the same chapter. Trade is never only trade. It's often money and power wearing a trade costume. And the reason this story matters for our tariff episode is that it shows how policy can behave like a bundle. Monetary conditions tighten or loosen. Currency values shift. And trade policy becomes a lever in a larger negotiation. This is why tariffs can feel like they arrive during moments of broader anxiety. They're rarely isolated. Summary of this section. Trade policy and monetary policy often move together during stress. Tariffs can be part of a bigger package, not a standalone event. Now we'll move forward a decade to a moment that feels surprisingly modern. US-Japan trade tension. 2. The 1980s, when competition becomes politics. In the 1980s, Japan's export strength, especially in autos and electronics, became a major political topic in the United States. This wasn't a simple economic story. It was a story about identity. What a country makes, where jobs exist, what feels like national decline or national confidence. And in these moments, trade policy becomes emotionally powerful because it offers a direct, visible action. Raise a tariff, set a quota, negotiate a restraint. A key feature of this era was the use of negotiated limits, agreements that constrained exports rather than relying purely on across-the-board tariffs. The calm lesson here isn't who was right. It's that when trade becomes a symbol of national status, the pressure to do something rises. And that something often trades long-term efficiency for short-term political clarity. There's another gentle lesson. These measures don't just change prices, they change investment plans. When trade access becomes uncertain, companies respond by changing where they build. Sometimes that means building inside the tariff wall, producing locally, hiring locally, and redesigning supply chains. That can be good for some regions and painful for others. But either way, it shows the same mechanism. Policy uncertainty reshapes geography. Summary of this section. When trade becomes political identity, governments reach for visible tools, and businesses respond by changing where they invest and produce. Now we'll do a short stop in the early 2000s, because it illustrates a subtlety people miss. Tariffs can help one group while quietly hurting another. 3. Early 2000s. Protection for some, costs for others. Tariffs often get sold as protecting jobs. And sometimes they do, within a targeted industry. But economies are webs. If you protect steel producers, you may raise costs for appliance makers, car makers, construction firms, machinery companies. So tariffs can behave like a transfer. They shift advantage to some firms, while imposing higher costs on downstream users. This is one reason tariff debates become confusing. People aren't arguing about the same thing. One person is thinking about the factory that's protected. Another person is thinking about the thousands of businesses that buy inputs and face higher costs. The economy doesn't deliver clean moral answers. It delivers trade-offs. And tariffs are a concentrated benefit with a more diffuse cost, a structure that often makes them politically durable. Summary of this section? Tariffs can protect a visible industry while spreading smaller costs across many others. Benefits feel concentrated, costs feel hidden. Now we'll move into the most modern parallel, because it maps neatly to today's environment of policy fog, the 2018 to 2019 tariff cycle. 4. 2018 to 2019. The modern template of escalation and adaptation. In the late 2000s, the US and China entered a tariff and retaliation cycle that became a defining macro story. Even if you weren't following the details, you likely felt the tone. Trade talks, threat cycles, deadlines, exemptions, retaliatory measures, supply chain rethinking. The real legacy of that period wasn't just the tariff rates. It was the psychological shift. Companies began to treat political risk like a permanent input. They started to ask, what happens if we build our entire supply chain in one jurisdiction and then policy turns? So you saw the rise of diversification, multi-sourcing, inventory buffers, and regional assembly strategies. This is when many executives learned, painfully, that efficiency is not the same as resilience. And this is also where we can gently connect to why tariff headlines trend so fast today. Because once you've lived through a tariff cycle, you don't treat the next one as theory. You treat it as a probability. And probabilities change behavior. Summary of this section. Modern tariff cycles taught companies to price in political risk, diversify supply chains, and trade some efficiency for resilience. Now let's return to the present and connect these historical patterns to what's happening in current news coverage. The emphasis on legal authority, durability, and uncertainty. 5. The current moment. Durability is the real variable. Recent headlines have focused on the legal basis for broad tariff authority, court decisions, and the pivot to alternate statutory authority to impose a temporary global tariff, starting at 10%, with discussion of raising it. For businesses, this isn't legal trivia. It's the question. Do we treat this as a stable new baseline or as a volatile negotiation phase? When the policy is framed as temporary, replaceable, or under active review, companies behave differently than when policy is framed as settled. Temporary policy creates short-term inventory pulls, short-term pricing moves, short-term hedges, and long-term hesitation. And that hesitation matters because investment decisions are where the long-run economy is born. Factories, equipment, training, R&D. Those are built in the absence of fog. Fog doesn't destroy investment, but it delays it. It makes it smaller. It makes it more cautious. And that is why tariff news can punch above its immediate dollar impact. It's not just the money at the border. It's the confidence in the map. Summary of this section. The most important variable isn't the tariff rate. It's whether the tariff regime feels stable enough to plan around. Now we'll do a quiet, practical bridge. How these cycles tend to end, and why the ending is often less dramatic than the beginning. 6. How tariff cycles usually resolve. Tariff cycles rarely end with a single grand finale. More often, they dissolve in one of three ways. 1. Negotiation and relabeling. Tariffs become part of a broader deal, sometimes with face-saving language on both sides. 2. Normalization. Businesses adapt, supply chains reroute, prices adjust, and the new reality becomes ordinary. 3. Escalation into a wider set of controls. Tariffs become one tool among many. Technology restrictions, export controls, sanctions, investment screening. This third path is where tariff talk begins to blend into the language of industrial policy and national security, which is exactly why the Dalio-style 5 kinds of conflict framing has resonated with people lately. But for a calm economics episode, we don't need to dramatize that. We only need to notice. Trade tools tend to spread once the logic of use economic tools for strategic goals becomes mainstream. And that mainstreaming is part of what we're living through. Summary of this section. Tariff cycles tend to resolve through deals, normalization, or expansion into broader economic tools. Now we'll place one more soft layer over all of this. A listener-friendly way to hold the concept without getting lost in headlines. 7. A simple way to think about it. If you want a gentle mental model that's easy to remember, here's one. Tariffs are like putting speed bumps on a road. Sometimes you put speed bumps in for safety. Sometimes you put them in to slow outsiders. Sometimes you put them in to force people to take a different route. But once speed bumps are there, everything changes. Delivery times, routing decisions, vehicle wear, fuel use, and eventually where people decide to build their homes and businesses. Now add uncertainty. If the speed bumps might move every month, you don't just drive slower. You might choose not to open the shop on that road at all. That's what uncertainty does. And that's why tariff headlines trend, because they're really headlines about the stability of the road. So far, we've treated tariffs like a moving weather system, not a moral argument. We've watched how uncertainty changes behavior, how businesses build buffers, how supply chains reroute, how anticipation becomes the event, and how history rhymes in smaller, calmer episodes. Trade and money traveling together, competition becoming politics, protection helping one group while quietly taxing another. To summarize that whole arc in one breath, tariffs rarely arrive alone. They arrive with uncertainty. And uncertainty is what turns a policy change into a macro force. Now let's tie the mechanism back to what's making tariffs trend right now, and then slowly bring it toward a more complete, listener-friendly landing, where you can hold the concept without clinging to headlines. In recent reporting, the spotlight hasn't just been on tariffs as a number. It's been on tariffs as a legal structure, because the durability of the structure tells businesses whether they should treat the regime as a stable baseline or a temporary negotiation phase. And when the structure changes quickly, when a court strikes down one pathway and policymakers pivot to another, the economy doesn't respond like a machine. It responds like a crowd. Some people rush to the exits, some people freeze, some people hedge, and most people simply slow down, because slowing down is the safest thing to do when the map is being redrawn while you're still driving. So let's describe the present moment in the calmest possible way, not the political way, the mechanical way. A major court decision invalidated a set of broad tariffs that had been imposed using emergency authority. The ruling had major economic implications, and it immediately raised practical questions about what would happen to collections at the border and what would happen to refunds. Then, almost immediately, a new approach appeared, a temporary global import surcharge beginning at about 10%, with officials indicating work underway to raise that temporary rate to 15%. A different legal lane, a different timeline. But for businesses, the same essential question: is this stable, or is this another step in a negotiation sequence? And notice how quickly the conversation moves from economics to administration. Because once a tariff is declared illegal, the next question is not philosophical, it's logistical. Who gets refunds? How? When? And under what process? And even how long the process might take. Reuters has described that the court did not specify how refunds should be handled, and that the illegal tariffs involved very large sums, with the potential refund pool discussed in the hundreds of billions, the kind of number that makes the whole situation feel heavier, even to people who don't follow trade day to day. And once a refund is possible, a new kind of market appears, because when a future payment becomes uncertain, but potentially valuable, someone will try to price it. And Reuters also reported that some investors and companies have been trading claims on possible tariff refunds, essentially turning uncertain future reimbursement into something like a financial asset, a claim with a haircut, a way to convert maybe later into some cash now. This is one of those moments where the world feels very modern, because the policy is old, tariffs are ancient, but the financial machinery around them adapts quickly. And there's another reason this all trends, because tariffs are one of the few economic policies that directly touch many categories at once: the legal system, the border agencies, business contracts, consumer prices, central bank expectations, market narratives, and political identity, all at the same time. So, if we want a gentle way to keep this grounded, we can hold on to one simple idea. When trade rules become uncertain, uncertainty doesn't stay in the trade department. It spills into pricing, forecasting, hiring, investing, and even the language executives use when they speak to investors. And this brings us back to something that tends to happen whenever tariffs become noisy. Markets try to guess what central banks will do. In recent days, Reuters described how tariff turmoil left Treasury markets dazed, with uncertainty about refunds and trade policy, and with the broader implication that the interest rate path becomes harder to read when tariff policy is moving underfoot. And if you're listening from the UK or Europe, you can still use the same mental model, because even when the policy is American, trade is global, prices transmit, supply chains cross borders, and uncertainty tends to travel faster than goods. Now let's summarize what we've just added before we move forward. We've added the present-day texture, court decisions, pivots in legal authority, a temporary surcharge at 10%, with discussion of 15%, uncertainty over refunds, and even a market for refund claims. And we've connected that to the reason this story gets so much attention, because it creates fog across multiple systems at once. Now we move into the part that makes this a complete, sleepy economist narrative. What does a tariff cycle do to the shape of the world over time? Not overnight, not in a single quarter, over time. Earlier, we used the speed bump metaphor. Tariffs are speed bumps. Uncertainty is moving the speed bumps around, and businesses prefer roads that don't change without warning. Now we add one more quiet image. Think of a river. Trade is a river. It flows where it is easiest to flow, where channels are deep and predictable. Tariffs are like rocks placed into the river. They don't stop the water, but they change the current. The water finds new channels, sometimes slowly, sometimes quickly. But once the river carves a new channel, the landscape changes. It can become the new normal. This helps explain something people sometimes find confusing. You can have a period where tariffs are high, but trade doesn't collapse. it reroutes. Reuters reported this kind of nuance in a recent piece citing the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, that tariffs have rerouted trade and not dented it as much as feared in some contexts, while still warning that continued turmoil could derail growth in some economies. That is a very important point for a calm episode, because it avoids the cartoon versions of trade policy. Trade is adaptive. People are adaptive. Businesses are adaptive. The question is not, does trade end? The question is, what does it become? What costs does adaptation create? And who pays those costs? Because adaptation has a price. To reroute a supply chain, you need new suppliers, new testing, new compliance, new logistics routes, sometimes new factories, and almost always new contracts. And contracts are where uncertainty hurts most, because contracts require a shared belief in stable rules. When stable rules weaken, contracts become shorter, more conditional, more hedged, more expensive. And this is one of the deeper reasons tariffs show up in narratives about productivity. Because a world that is slightly less efficient, but more redundant, can be more resilient, but it can also be more expensive. And if it is more expensive, real incomes can feel squeezed, even when the headline economy is still growing. Now we can fold in another dimension that is trending in macro conversations alongside tariffs. The broader sense that the global rules-based order is under strain and that economic tools are increasingly being used for strategic goals, not just for growth. You already brought Ray Dalio into the channel, and he's not the only one. The Munich Security Report 2026 is literally titled Under Destruction, and its framing is about how political forces favoring destruction over reform are shaping international order and whether institutions can hold under that pressure. You don't have to agree with every line of that framing to notice the resonance with tariffs. Tariffs become especially salient when people think the era of smooth globalization is fading and the era of strategic economic policy is rising. And that's why tariffs trend not just as economics, but as culture. They become symbols. They become proof of a narrative. They become props in a story about strength, safety, independence, fairness. And symbols are powerful. But we are not here to argue symbols. We are here to understand mechanisms. So, let's summarize what we've just added. We added the idea that tariffs don't necessarily reduce trade. They can reroute it. The river finds new channels, but the rerouting has cost. Contracts shorten, redundancy increases. And that sits inside a broader world mood where economic tools are used more strategically, which is why the topic keeps trending across economics and geopolitics at the same time. Now we bring it closer to the listener again, not in a dramatic way, in a practical way. If you are a household, tariffs can feel like a slow drift. A few pounds here, a few % there, a product line that quietly changes, a coupon that disappears, a delivery time that stretches, a store that says out of stock more often than it used to. If you are a small business, tariffs can feel like paperwork and a supplier that suddenly can't promise lead times and a new line item on invoices. If you are a large company, tariffs can feel like a board meeting where someone says, we need an alternate supplier. And someone else says it will take 12 months. And someone else says, do it anyway, because we can't be exposed to a single jurisdiction anymore. In each case, the feeling is different, but the mechanism is the same. Uncertainty increases the value of optionality. Optionality means having choices. Choices mean redundancy. Redundancy costs money. And this is how uncertainty becomes inflationary without anyone deciding to be inflationary. Not because people are greedy, because people are cautious. Now let's do a gentle pivot into one of the most useful, non-obsessive ways to hold the whole subject. What does this do to forecasting? Forecasting is a fragile craft. It's fragile because most of the time, the future is not a single point. It's a range. And when the policy regime is unstable, the range widens. Executives stop speaking in firm numbers. They start speaking in scenarios. Central banks stop speaking in confident paths. They start speaking in conditional probabilities. Markets stop trading on earnings. They start trading on narratives about what the rules will be. That is why a single tariff headline can move so many asset prices at once. Currencies, bonds, equities, commodities. Because the headline is not just about a tax on goods. It's about the reliability of the rules. So, if you want the calm, sleepy Economist takeaway that you can hold in your mind without tension, here it is. Tariffs are less important as a number than as a signal of regime. A regime is the set of expectations that people plan around. When the regime becomes uncertain, planning becomes cautious. Cautious planning becomes slower investment. Slower investment becomes slower growth, or at least a different kind of growth. And different growth feels different. It can feel more uneven, more regional, more political. Now, before we transition onward, one more short summary, so the flow stays easy. We connected today's headlines, court rulings, new temporary surcharges, and refund uncertainty. With the deeper pattern, trade flows reroute like a river. Adaptation costs money, uncertainty makes contracts shorter, and redundancy higher. And this sits inside a broader mood where economic tools are used strategically, which makes tariffs trend as both economics and culture. And now we're set up for the next chunk, where we will do two things. We'll gently name the winners and losers without turning it into politics, simply by describing who tends to benefit in tariff cycles and who tends to absorb costs. And then we'll write the closing stretch of the whole episode, a calm ending that brings it back to the central idea. When the rules change, the economy adapts. But adaptation is not free, and the biggest cost is often the fog, not the tariff itself. So far, we've moved through tariffs as a tax, tariffs as a signal, tariffs as a bargaining tool. We've watched the fog effect, the way uncertainty spreads through planning, pricing, hiring, and investment. We've traced a simple product from border to shelf. We've looked at rules of origin and friendshoring. We've let history rhyme without turning it into a lecture. And we've returned to the present moment, where legal pathways, temporary surcharges, and refund uncertainty are themselves part of the economic story. To summarize all of that in the simplest possible way, tariffs matter, but the way people respond to them often matters more. Now, without turning this into politics, it helps to say one quiet truth that sits underneath almost every tariff cycle. Tariffs tend to create winners and losers, but not in the neat, obvious way people expect. A tariff can help a protected producer. Sometimes it stabilizes jobs in a specific industry, and that benefit is tangible, it's visible, it has a face. But the costs often spread out. They appear as slightly higher input costs for many other businesses, slightly higher prices for many households, more paperwork, more delays, more caution. And those costs are diffuse, harder to point to, easier to ignore until they accumulate. And that accumulation is what changes the texture of the economy. Because the economy is not just a set of prices, it's a set of habits, it's confidence, it's long contracts and long plans. It's the willingness to build something that won't pay off for years. When the rules feel stable, people build. When the rules feel unstable, people hedge. And hedging is not evil, it's not greedy, it's not cynical, it's human. It's what any organism does in a changing environment. You keep a little more water in the cupboard. You keep a little more cash in the account. You keep a second supplier on standby. You keep a little more margin in your pricing. You shorten your commitments. You wait for clarity. That's the core mechanism again, and it's worth repeating one last time, because it is the simplest and most useful thing in this whole episode. Uncertainty is expensive, not because it hurts feelings, but because it changes decisions. And the way uncertainty becomes expensive is almost always through the same pathway. Optionality becomes valuable. Optionality requires redundancy. Redundancy costs money, and those costs show up in the background, in prices, in productivity, in growth, and in the quiet tone of corporate guidance. So when tariffs trend, when headlines flare, the most important question is often not, what is the tariff rate today? It's, what is the policy regime likely to be for long enough that people can plan? Because planning is the soil the economy grows in. Now, here's a calm way to hold the entire subject, so you don't have to carry 1,000 details. Think of an economy like a network of roads. Trade is traffic, goods moving, parts moving, ideas moving, money moving, plans moving. A tariff is a toll. Sometimes a toll is meant to pay for something. Sometimes it's meant to discourage something. Sometimes it's meant to pressure someone to take a different route. A toll changes the cost of a trip. And once you add a toll, some people reroute, some people pay it, some people drive less, some people choose a different destination entirely. But uncertainty is not a toll. Uncertainty is when the toll booth moves, when the amount changes, when the sign is unclear, when you don't know if you'll be charged twice, when you don't know if the road will close. When the toll booth moves, it doesn't just change the cost of a trip. It changes whether people commit to building a business on that road in the first place. And that is why, in the long run, the world is shaped less by any single tariff line and more by the accumulation of choices people make when they stop believing the route is stable. Now, if we're going to end with something practical, something calm, something that doesn't ask you to watch the news, it would be this. You don't need to predict tariff policy to understand the economy. You just need to notice the signals of uncertainty. When you hear companies talk about visibility, about policy volatility, about pulling forward shipments, about building inventory, about reconfiguring supply chains, about pricing actions, you are hearing the economy adapt in real time. And adaptation is what economies do. They don't stop, they bend, they reroute like rivers, they find new channels. The channel might be less efficient, it might be more expensive, it might be more redundant, it might be more regional, it might be more strategic, but it becomes normal because people adjust. And then they build the next layer of life on top of the new normal. And that is probably the most soothing thought in all of this. Even when the rules change, the world keeps moving. Even when the headlines are loud, the actual mechanics are slow and practical. Contracts, shipments, factories, inventory, prices, habits. So if you're listening tonight and the world feels a little too sharp, a little too fast, a little too uncertain, it may help to remember that economics is often the study of people adapting quietly, with imperfect information, doing their best to build stability in a shifting landscape. Tariffs are one of the old tools that can make the landscape shift. But the deeper story is always the same. We respond to the rules we believe in. And when the rules become unclear, we pay for clarity with caution. That's the episode. Not a verdict, not a battle cry, just a calm map of how the system tends to behave. And now you can let it go. Let the details dissolve. Keep only the soft shape of it. A toll is a cost. Fog is a cost. And when the fog clears, people build again. Good night.